Night moved across the ranch without sound. 3 riders came in from the northwest, where no trail ran and no honest man rode after dark. Their horses walked slow, hooves muffled on the frozen ground. One man swung down at the lean-to. Hay stood stacked high against the barn wall, brittle from months without rain. He reached into his coat. A match scraped once against stone. The small flame held in the wind, then bent low and touched the edge of the straw. Fire found the dry stalks fast. It climbed without hurry, tasting each blade, growing as the cold air fed it. Smoke rose thin and gray against the stars. Inside the house, a floorboard answered. A lantern flared behind the kitchen glass. The curtain shifted. The man at the fire did not turn. He watched the flames take hold a moment longer, then stepped back into the saddle. The 3 riders wheeled away into the dark, leaving the fire to finish what they had started. The land held its breath. The letter was not long. That was the first thing Nalin noticed about it. Most men who placed advertisements in the Guthrie Courier wrote like they were trying to sell something. Long sentences, warm words that meant nothing. Promises wrapped in politeness that dissolved the moment you looked too closely. This one did not bother. 7 lines, maybe 8. Written by a man who chose words the way a careful person chooses, which boards to step on crossing a rotten floor. Not from fear, from habit, from a long time of knowing that extra weight in the wrong place costs you. She read it twice on the steps of the post office, then folded it along its original creases and put it inside her coat pocket. Around her, Guthrie went about its Tuesday morning. A wagon loaded with fence posts rattled past. 2 men stood outside the feed store, talking without looking at each other. The woman behind the general store's counter watched through the glass, the way people in small towns watch, when they believe they are being subtle about it. They are never being subtle about it. Nalin sat on the top step of the post office and let the morning move around her. The wind came from the north, cold, but not committed to it yet, the kind of cold that was still making up its mind. She pressed her thumb along the folded edge of the letter. He had written, "I need someone who can cook and keep a house and is not afraid of hard work. I have a cattle operation 9 miles outside Reed Creek. The work is steady, the arrangement honest, room and board until things are sorted. If it suits us both, we can speak to the Reverend before winter. If it suits us both." That was how he had put it. Not "I hope you will consider." Not "I am looking for a woman of good character." Not the elaborate courtesies men used when they wanted something and didn't want to seem like they wanted it. Just, "If it suits us both." Like a man stating the terms of a business arrangement with someone he already respected before he had met them. Before he had any reason to, Nalin did not know what to do with that. She filed it away. In the part of her mind where she kept things she was still deciding about. She was 31 years old. She had buried a husband in 1872, in the dry ground outside a settlement that no longer existed, with no one to speak words over him, except herself and the wind. She had buried a child the year after, smaller grave. Harder to leave, 4 years since then. 4 years of making herself useful in towns that were not hers, in a territory that was not hers either, if you were being honest about it. And Nalin was always being honest about it. She had been in Guthrie since spring, taking in mending, shirts with blown-out elbows, dresses with torn hems. Work that required precision and patience and absolutely no conversation which suited her. She was not unfriendly. She simply had learned over a long time that explaining yourself to people who had already decided what you were cost more than it returned. In Guthrie, she was the Indian woman who sews. That was the whole of it. That was as much as most people needed to know. She had read the advertisement 3 weeks before receiving the letter. In the back pages of the Courier, between a notice for a lost mule and an announcement about a church social. Man seeks wife. Cattle operation, Reed Creek area, hard work. Honest terms. She had read it and set the paper down, picked it up again an hour later, written the letter that evening. Factual, no sentiment, just what she could do, what she had done, what she was not afraid of. And then, because she did not know how to be other than what she was, she had written that she was Apache on her father's side. that her mother was white, that she had grown up between two worlds and could work in either. She expected no reply, which was, she had learned, the safest way to expect things. The reply had come in 10 days. She did not decide immediately. She sat with it. 3 days, actually, which was probably longer than a sensible person needed to decide, about a letter from a cattle rancher in Reed Creek. But Nolan had learned that the decisions you made in a hurry were the ones you spent the most time living with afterward. She thought about the letter at night, lying on the narrow cot in the rooming house on 2nd Street, listening to the sounds of Guthrie. Settling into dark, she thought about the 7 lines, the absence of warmth that was not the same as coldness. If it suits us both, she thought about winter coming, about the rooming house going cold in January, about Mrs. Harbert, the landlady, who was not unkind but who looked at Nallen sometimes, the way you look at something you cannot quite categorize. And discomfort you cannot categorize is worse, usually, than discomfort you understand. She thought about the mending pile that was getting thinner, and she thought about something she could not name exactly, a feeling that had been with her for 4 years. Not grief, exactly. Not loneliness, exactly. Something more like the sensation of standing in a doorway and not being able to decide which room you belong in. On the 4th morning, she packed her bag cancasse. Not large. She had learned over years to carry only what she needed, and she had learned that what she needed was considerably less than what she had once thought. Sewing basket with the broken clasp, she held shut with her thumb when she lifted it. Extra dress, small tin of salt, thread case, bone-handled knife, and the letter, folded in her coat pocket. She told Mrs. Harbert she was leaving. Mrs. Harbert said she was sorry to see her go and looked, briefly, like she meant it. Nallen believed her. People were complicated that way. She took the morning train to Stillwater, then a hired wagon to Reed Creek, and then she walked. Reed Creek on a Tuesday morning in late October looked like most small towns in Oklahoma Territory looked in late October, purposeful, slightly tired. Going about its business without much ornamentation, the post office, a feed store, a milliner's that doubled as a notions shop, a general store with a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising coffee, salt, lamp oil, and sundries, and a livery at the end of the main street where the road bent south toward open country. She saw the buckboard first, old, but not neglected. The boards had been replaced in sections, different wood tones, side by side, repairs made when repairs were needed, not all at once. The kind of care that did not come from money. It came from attention, from looking at a thing regularly enough to notice when something was starting to go wrong before it went completely. Then she saw the man, standing beside one of the horses, his hand flat on the animal's neck, moving in slow circles just behind the ear, the way you would with a horse that had been pushed hard and needed to be reminded it was safe. He did not look toward the post office. He did not look toward anything in particular. She slowed before she reached him. Not from hesitation. From the habit she had built over 31 years of reading a situation before walking into it. The horses were thin. Not starving, not mistreated. Thin in the way that said, the land had been asking more than it had been giving back. She knew that look. She had seen it on animals. She had seen it on people. His clothes were work clothes. Clean, but worn in the particular way that meant he had been wearing them a long time. His hat was pushed back on his head. His jaw had not been shaved in several days. Not from carelessness, from the fact that shaving required standing, still at a mirror, for 5 minutes. And he had not had 5 minutes to stand still. He was perhaps 45. The sun made those years precise in some men, and difficult to count in others. In him it had made them precise. He looked like a man who had been 45 for a while, like he had arrived there and understood it and moved on. She stopped a few feet away. He turned then, not quickly, just completed the motion and let his hand fall from the horse's neck. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been expecting but did not let himself picture too clearly. A long moment then. "Are you the one who answered the advertisement?" Not a question exactly. The tone was flat. The way you state a thing you are fairly certain of and give the other person room to correct. I am, she said. He looked at her. Not the way men sometimes looked at her in new towns. Measuring what her situation was, what could be made of it, how much leverage it gave someone who wanted leverage. He looked at her the way he had been looking at the horse. Attention that wanted information. Not advantage, he said.
There's a room off the kitchen, window that faces east.
You'd have the mornings. She did not know what to make of that. The detail of the window. The mornings offered like they were something of value, which she supposed they were. She filed it away. He said, "The work is hard. I won't tell you otherwise. The herd is down. Land wants more water than it's been getting. I've got one hand who's been with me since 71. Does the work of 2 men. But there are things he can't manage and things I can't manage either." What kind of things? Books are a disaster. The calves need watching at night in cold weather. Someone who knows what they're doing with a sick animal can mean the difference between losing it and not. I grew up on my father's land, she said. Sheep, mostly. But his people read livestock different than you do. They read what the animal is telling you, not just what it looks like. He was quiet for a moment. Not dismissive quiet, thinking quiet, then he picked up the reins. It's about 2 hours out, he said. His name was Ward Callum. She learned this on the wagon. He offered it the way he offered most things, plainly, without decoration. Ward Callum, 45. Born in this territory before it was a territory. His father had run cattle here before him. His father's father had come from somewhere east that Ward did not mention. She told him her name. He repeated it once. Correctly, and did not ask her to give him something easier to say. Small thing. She noticed it. The road out of Reed Creek was dry and rutted from the last hard rain that had come weeks too late to matter. She sat on the bench beside him without holding the edge of it, letting her body learn the movement of the wagon rather than fighting it. The spare horse he had been tending was tied at the back, hooves finding a rhythm in the dust. He didn't speak for a long time. She didn't fill the silence. She looked at the land instead. The land red dry from the wagon seat. She didn't need to touch it to know. The sky was wide and the color of old tin, and there were no clouds moving in it anywhere. She understood something about the water problem before he said another word about it. The land told you plainly. If you knew how to read it. After a time, he said. My wife passed 3 years ago. She let that settle. October, he added, like the month mattered. And maybe it did. October had a weight to it in some years that other months didn't carry. I'm sorry, she said. He nodded. Didn't offer more. Didn't ask about hers. She didn't offer more either. Some things you carry, and you do not hand them to people you just met. The wagon crested a low rise, and the ranch came visible below. A house. A barn. 3 outbuildings. A corral with maybe 35 head moving slow in the afternoon light. She looked at the corral, looked at the size of it relative to the number inside. Someone had built that fence expecting a larger life than the one currently contained within it. Ward pulled up, and for a moment they both looked at it from the rise. She didn't know if that was his habit, or if he was seeing it through her eyes, feeling something about what it looked like now compared to what it had looked like before. She said, "The bones are still good." He looked at her. "The barn's solid," she said. "The house sits level. You've got water somewhere or you'd have left already." "Creek on the east side," he said. "Runs low in summer, but it runs. And the grass comes back if the water comes back." He didn't answer that. But he picked up the reins, and they came down off the rise toward it. The man named Fitch Dupree was coming out of the barn when they rolled in, 58, gray at the temples. Built like a man who had spent 4 decades doing physical work and had not entirely made peace with what that had done to his knees. He looked at her without expression, then looked at Ward. "You got her," he said. Not a question, not a greeting. Ward climbed down and started unhitching the horses. "She's got the room off the kitchen." Fitch looked at her again, not unfriendly. Assessing, the way the other man had been assessing. She was beginning to understand it was simply the economy of this place. No one had time to pretend. No one had energy to waste on social performance. She climbed down from the wagon, without waiting for assistance. Fitch watched that. Something in his face settled. Like a small question had been answered to his satisfaction. He went back into the barn. The room off the kitchen was small. A cot, a window that faced east, a single hook on the wall. The window had no curtain, but the glass was whole. She counted that as a point in the house's favor. She set her bag on the cot and stood for a moment in the quiet. Outside, she could hear the two men talking low. The sound of the horse being led to the water trough. The creak of the barn door. The cattle in the corral shifting and settling as the light dropped. She unpacked the way she always unpacked, practical things first. Extra dress on the hook. Tin of salt, thread case, bone-handled knife on the windowsill. She had learned years ago not to put necessities at the bottom of a bag. When you needed them quickly. That was the nature of necessities. She stood at the window and looked east for a moment, before she went back to work. The grass on that side was different from the grass she had passed on the road in. More moisture somewhere in the ground, something holding on under the surface. She noted it, without knowing yet what it would mean. When she came back into the kitchen, the stove was cold and the wood box was nearly empty. She found kindling in a bucket beside the back door. Wood stacked under the lean-to. She built the fire without asking permission. Because fire in a cold kitchen was not a question of permission. It was a question of sense. By the time Ward came in from the barn, she had water heating. She had located the beans and the salt pork on the shelf, above the dry sink, and had a rough inventory of what was in the house and what was not. The list of what was not was longer. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the stove, looked at her. She said, "You want to eat tonight?" He took his hat off and hung it on the post by the door. "Fitch and I usually manage something. This will be better." He didn't argue. He washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the table. She noticed he sat with his back to the wall, facing the door. A habit so old and deep, he probably no longer knew he still had it. A man who had learned, in the ordinary course of his life, that being able to see what was coming gave you a few extra seconds. Fitch came in a few minutes later, sat down across from Ward, took his own hat off and set it on his knee. Neither of them spoke much. She worked at the stove and listened to the shape of their silence. It was comfortable. The silence of two men who had been in the same difficult situation long enough to stop talking about it. When she put the food on the table, Fitch looked at his bowl, then looked at her. "That's more than we've had it once in a while," he said. "I found the beans," she said. "We know where the beans are. Then you know where they'll be tomorrow." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Something near it. He turned back to his bowl. Ward ate without comment. He ate all of it. She noted that without storing it as evidence of anything larger. He was hungry. The food was adequate. Those were facts. After he finished, he took his own plate to the basin. Fitch did the same. She hadn't expected that. She washed up while they went back out to check the livestock. The window above the basin had gone dark. Through the glass, the first stars were coming on over the eastern ridge. She stood at that window longer than she needed to. She did not sleep immediately. She sat on the edge of the cot with her hands in her lap and listened to the house settle around her. The barn was quiet. The cattle were quiet. The wind moved through the gap between the house and the woodshed with a low, steady sound like something being careful. She thought about the letter, the 7 lines. "If it suits us both." She thought about the way he had sat at the table. Back to the wall, facing the door, she thought about the corral, the size of it, the gap between what someone had built and what now lived inside it. She thought about the grass, thin, pale, trying, and she thought about the land itself, the way it had looked from the rise, not dead, but asking. The way a living thing asks when it has been overlooked for long enough. She understood that feeling. She understood it precisely. She lay down and pulled the blanket over her, and the house went on settling around her, making its small sounds, adjusting to its own weight. Outside, something moved through the dry grass. Wind, or an animal. She couldn't tell. It did not alarm her. It was just the land being what it was. Alive in the way land is alive, slowly, without drama, without asking for acknowledgement. She slept. She was awake an hour before the sky changed color. She had always been this way, long before the years that had taught her to sleep lightly. Even as a child, she had woken in the dark, with the particular clarity of someone whose body had finished resting, and was ready to be useful. She dressed in the dark, built the fire before either man came in from the bunkhouse. She had found the night before tucked behind a sack of cornmeal, as if someone had set it there, and then forgotten it, a slab of salt pork that she had checked and approved. She sliced it thin and set it in the pan and stood back from the grease. Ward came in first. He stopped in the doorway the same way he had the night before. She didn't turn around. "You don't have to start this early," he said. "Fire needs to be laid regardless," she said. He came to the table and sat down. She could hear him behind her. The particular quiet of a man who is watching something, but not wanting to be seen watching. She set a plate in front of him. He looked at it, then looked at her. "Where'd you find the pork?" "Behind the cornmeal." He was quiet a moment. "That's been there since last October." "It's fine," she said. "I checked it." He picked up his fork. Fitch came in a few minutes later, sat down across from Ward, looked at the plate, then looked at her, then looked out the window. She poured coffee and set the pot on the trivet and went to stand at the kitchen window, looking in out at a light coming up over the eastern grass. The cattle were moving. She could see them from here, drifting toward the water trough at the fence line, slow and deliberate as old men. She counted 28, maybe 30. Then, not in the way of starvation, but in the way of shortage. The light caught the angles of them when they turned. Behind her, Ward said, "There were 50 head in the spring." She didn't turn around. What happened? Dry summer. Then 2 went down with something, and others followed. Lost 11 between July and September. What was wrong with them? Respiratory, mostly. The dry brought the dust up. The weak ones couldn't manage it. She stayed at the window a moment longer. "I'd like to ride the fence line today," she said. He was quiet. Then, "Can you ride?" She turned and looked at him. He held her gaze. Not apologetically. He was asking because he needed to know, not because he doubted her. "Yes," she said. He nodded once and went out to saddle the horses. He brought 2 horses around. Hers was a short bay mare, one white sock, patient eye. The kind of horse that had been through enough to stop being surprised by things. She liked that in a horse. Ward was already mounted before she had gathered the reins, watching the middle distance. They rode east first, along the lower fence. She didn't talk. He didn't talk. The ground was harder than it should have been for late October. Not frozen, just compressed, tired. She could see where the grass had come back in patches, sparse pale green against the dry yellow of everything surrounding it, and where it hadn't. There were sections along the fence where the earth was cracked in long, shallow lines. The kind that meant water had run off the surface for years instead of into it. She slowed twice to look at those places. Ward stopped both times without being asked and waited. The second time, she dismounted and crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. It gave about an inch and stopped, hard underneath. The roots of the dead grass beside the fence post were short. She could see them where the cracking had exposed the edges. Shallow roots, which meant the grass had never been given reason to go deep. She stood and looked out at the pasture, then looked back at the house, small in the distance. "Did you rotate them?" she asked. He said, "It's one pasture." She looked at him. He wasn't defensive about it. He said it the way a man says a thing that has become obvious to him only recently, in the way that obvious things sometimes do. Too late. After the cost has already been paid, she remounted, and they continued. The fence itself was in good repair. She noticed that. The posts were set solid. The wire was tight, the corners braced properly. Whoever had built this fence had known what they were doing, or had learned before it mattered. At the north end, where the land tilted slightly and the fence turned to follow what had once been a creek bed, she stopped again. There was grass here, more of it, greener, growing in the low ground where some moisture still held, a strip of maybe 40 yards running along the dry creek bed before it disappeared into the flat. She looked at it for a long moment. That's the only stretch that came back worth anything, Ward said. She looked at the creek bed, dry now, but the shape was there, the curve of the bank, the dark line in the soil where water had traveled once. How many acres do you have on the other side of that ridge? She asked. He looked at her. Another 160. But the fence ends here. She turned her horse and looked at the ridge. It wasn't much of a ridge, more a gentle rise, the kind the land made without effort, the kind a man could ride over without noticing he had crossed anything significant. But from where she sat, she could see that the grass on the far side was different. Not the pale, exhausted yellow of overgrazed ground. Something closer to copper. The kind of color that meant the root system was still alive. Still holding. Just waiting. What's on the other side? She asked. Nothing much anymore. Old fence line from when my father ran more head than the land could hold. Most of it's broke down by now. When was that? 16. 17 years ago, she sat with that. 16 years of a fence going to pieces, while the land on this side went with it. She looked at the strip of green along the dry creek bed, looked at the rise. Measured something in her head that she didn't have a name for, yet. Only the shape of it. That moisture has to be going somewhere, she said. He didn't answer right away. She could hear his horse shift its weight behind her. There's a spring, other side of the ridge. My father dug it out, but it silted back in. 2, maybe 3 years ago. I've been meaning to clear it. She looked at him. He said it the way a man says something he has been not saying for a long time. Not ashamed exactly. More like he had grown accustomed to the weight of it, and had stopped noticing the weight. She turned back to the ridge, a spring on the other side that had silted over. 2 or 3 years of slow blocking, while the land on this side went dry and the cattle went thin, and the arithmetic of the place went wrong in every direction, and a trough down at the corral that 30 head of thin cattle were depending on. If you cleared the spring, she said slowly, and brought the water down along this creek bed, and put a fence along the ridgeline, how much of that grass do you think would come back? He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. He had thought of it. She could see that plainly. Not the look of a man hearing something new. The look of a man who had decided somewhere bare along the way that knowing what needed to be done was not the same as being able to do it. That the gap between the plan and the means had been open so long it had become just another feature of the landscape. She knew that look. She had worn it herself. I'm not asking what it would cost, she said. I'm asking what would grow. He looked at the creek bed, then at the ridge, then back at her. Soil over there is better than what I've got on this side, he said slowly. My father always said so. Said there was a reason he ran cattle on it until there was nothing left, she nodded. I'd like to see the spring, she said. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned his horse toward the ridge. They rode the ridgeline for the better part of an hour. She did not talk while she looked. She had learned that talking while looking cost you something, divided your attention in a way that made you see what you expected rather than what was there. So she kept quiet and let the land come to her. The grass on the far side was shorter than what grew below, but it was a different color. Not the pale, exhausted yellow of the overgrazed ground on the other side, closer to copper. The kind of color that meant the root system was still alive, waiting. She stopped at the house point and looked north along where the creek bed ran. The channel was shallow, but the shape was there, the curve, the way the bank dropped, the dark line of the soil where moisture had traveled once and could travel again. It would take work, several weeks of it, probably. And help. But the channel was there. You could not dig what was not there. You could not build on the shape of land that did not have it. He had stopped a few yards behind her, watching her, she thought, rather than the land. She said without turning, I'd want to see the spring itself before anything else. He said he could take her. They rode down off the ridge and into the dry bed of the lower creek. The ground was harder here. Cracked in the long plates she had come to recognize as the sign of a water table that had dropped and stayed down. But 20 minutes north, the soil changed. The cracks closed. The ground went softer under the horse's hooves. And the smell changed too, something mineral, something that had been sealed under dry earth for a long time. The spring was not much to look at, a low wet spot in a hollow between two outcroppings, mud and a thin skim of standing water around the edge, a ring of dead sedge standing in the outer margin, brown and dry, but still standing. Whatever had blocked the spring had done it gradually. A slow silting over years. The kind of thing that happens without anyone realizing until one season the trough doesn't fill the way it used to, and then the next season it fills less, and then one spring it doesn't fill at all. She dismounted and crouched at the edge, pressed her hand into the mud. It came up dark and wet. Not the memory of moisture, real moisture. Water behind it waiting. She looked at the blockage, a shelf of compressed silt and gravel backed up against the rock. 4 feet wide, maybe 5. "What's sitting on top of the inlet?" she said. Ward came around and crouched beside her. He looked at it for a moment. Then, silt, built up from the north. "Used to clear it every few years, when my father ran this." She pressed her fingers into the edge of the shelf, felt where it gave and where it held. Built a rough map of the blockage in her mind. Left side softer, right side compressed against limestone. Start left, angle east on the second day. She stood and wiped her hand on her skirt. "This is a 2-day job," she said. He looked at her, then at the shelf, then back at her. "I'll get the spade," he said. He rode back to the barn for the tools, while she stayed at the hollow. She did not wander. She crouched again at the edge of the wet spot and worked 2 fingers into the silt shelf, feeling the resistance, feeling which side would break first. Feeling the water behind it, not with certainty, but with the particular kind of listening her father's people had taught her before she was old enough to understand she was being taught anything. You did not force water. You asked where it wanted to go, and then you got out of its way. When Ward returned with the spade, she had already decided which side to open first. She took off her coat and folded it over the saddle horn. He handed her the spade, without comment. They dug in shifts. He cut the first layer, the top crust of compacted gravel that had not seen real moisture in years. It came up in slabs. She took the next shift and worked the softer material beneath, the dark silt that ran almost like paste when the spade hit it right. They did not talk much. The hollow was quiet except for the sound of steel and wet earth, the occasional shift of a horse, the birds that came in low and then veered away, startled by the disturbance. Mid-afternoon, Ward's spade hit something different, a hollow note instead of a flat one. The tool sank differently. He stepped back. Water seeped into the cut, slow at first, the color of weak tea. Then, as the seconds passed clearing, she watched from the edge. Neither of them spoke. The water came, tentative at first, then with more purpose. It found the low ground and moved along it, feeling its way, the way water always does, not forcing, just going where the ground allowed. By the time the light started dropping, they had opened the inlet enough to see real flow. It moved along the bottom of the hollow and pooled against the far outcropping, and the dead sedge at the outer ring was already standing in half an inch of water. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. Ward stood with the spade handle resting against his shoulder and watched the water move. His face had changed. Not the relief of a problem being solved. Not the satisfaction of work completed. Something older than that. Something that lived below the practical. Like a man watching a thing come back that he had stopped believing would come back. She looked away. Some expressions were not meant to be watched. They rode back in the last of the daylight. She was tired in the clean way that comes from work. That went the way work was supposed to go. The kind of tired that is an argument for the day rather than against it. He stayed alongside her the whole ride back. Not half a length ahead the way he sometimes rode when the trail allowed. She noticed. At the barn he unsaddled both horses. She filled the water pails without being asked, and they moved around each other in the dim space without once being in each other's way. Like two people who had learned each other's movements faster than expected. Or like two people whose movements had always been compatible and who were only now discovering it. In the kitchen, she started the fire. He set the coffee on without asking if she wanted any. She looked at the window. The last color had gone out of the sky. He set a cup on the counter near her. He didn't say anything, just set it there and stepped back. She wrapped both hands around it and stood there. A moment, the warmth working through her palms before she went back to the stove. She did not know what to do with a man who offered thick things, without ceremony and without keeping score. She was working on it. She did not know about the money yet, not precisely. Not the number, not the name on the other end of it, but she was not unobservant. She had been in this house 6 days. She had cooked 6 meals, and carried 6 mornings of water from the well, and stood at the kitchen window enough times to understand the arithmetic of this place, without anyone explaining it to her. The herd was too small for the land. The land was too dry for the herd. The barn was well built, but the smaller outbuildings showed signs of deferred repair. The kind of deferred repair that does not come from carelessness. It comes from choosing, from looking at a list of things that need doing and asking yourself which one you cannot afford to let wait one more season. And choosing wrong, sometimes. Because sometimes all the options are wrong. She had seen this before. Not in cattle, in people. In the years after her father's band had been pushed from the land they had always moved across. In the years of making do. Of reading the seasons, not for what they offered, but for what you could extract from them, if you were careful enough and quiet enough, and did not ask for more than the land was willing to give. She understood Ward Callum better than he probably knew. That was all right. She was not in a hurry. On the 7th night, she opened the account books. She had not done it before. She had waited until she understood enough about the physical reality of the place, the land, the livestock, the state of things, to be able to read numbers in context. Numbers without context were just numbers. Numbers in context were a map. She sat at the kitchen table after supper. The fire burned low. The house was quiet. Ward and Fitch in the bunkhouse. The cattle settled in the corral. She opened the ledger. Ward's handwriting was precise, small, the handwriting of a man who did not waste paper. The columns were neat, but the numbers told a story that the neatness could not conceal. She found it on the 3rd page alone, taken in the spring of 1874, from the First Bank of Reed Creek, amount substantial, repayable in full, principal plus accumulated interest at 18% per annum by April 1876, 5 months away. She looked at the current herd count, the cattle value, the land value, the cost of feed through winter, the creek, which was currently not producing enough water to sustain meaningful expansion. She turned the numbers over in her head for a long time. When the fire dropped to coals, she was still sitting there. She did not go to Ward that night. She needed to think before she spoke. That was the way she had always been made. You did not put words on a problem before you understood its shape. The shape here was clear. The ranch owed more than it could pay. And the man holding the note was someone named Edgar Pruitt. She had not heard that name yet. She would. In the morning, she asked Ward to take her to see all of it. He looked at her. All of it? He said. The spring, the East Ridge, the full fence line. Everything that's yours. He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face shifted, almost imperceptible. The particular look of a man who was not used to being asked to show someone everything. Most people asked for the part that looked best. All right, he said. They rode out in the early light. She didn't tell him what she had found in the ledger. Not yet. She needed to see the land first, because the land was either the answer or it wasn't. And if it wasn't, then nothing else mattered. And if it was, she would need to understand it completely before she said a word. The spring was running better. Even one day had made a difference. The flow had widened the cut overnight, and the water had found more of its old channel. She crouched and looked at it for a moment, and she felt something that she did not have an easy word for. Not triumph, too small for that. More like the satisfaction of having been right about something that mattered. They rode the East Ridge. She had been right about the grass, the copper color, alive underneath, waiting. She had been right about the soil, better than the overgrazed west side, deeper, more structure. Given water, it would produce. She was quiet for the whole of it. Ward rode beside her and let her think that she was beginning to understand was one of the most significant things about him. He let her think. He did not fill the silence with reassurance or explanation, or the particular kind of talking that men sometimes did when they were uncomfortable with quiet. He simply rode and waited and was present without being demanding. It was rarer than she had expected. When they reached the top of the eastern ridge and looked down at the strip of green along the creek bed, now carrying a thin but real line of water from the spring, she stopped her horse. She looked at the numbers in her head, the acreage, the water, the cattle, the timeline. She turned to Ward. "We need to talk about the books," she said. He went still, just slightly. The way a man goes still when someone says the thing he has been waiting for someone to say and dreading at the same time. "I know," he said. "Edgar Pruitt." She said, a long silence. "I know," he said again. The wind moved through the dry grass below them. The water in the creek bed caught the morning light and held it. She said, "Tell me everything," and Ward Callum, a man who had not told anyone everything in a very long time, looked at the land. His father had left him and began to speak. Ward talked for a long time, longer than she had ever heard him talk. They stayed on the ridge while he told it. The wind moved through the grass below them. The water in the creek bed caught the light. Neither of them looked at the other very much. They both looked at the land, she was beginning to understand, the way Ward Callum talked about difficult things. He looked at something else. Something that couldn't react. Something that would just hold still and receive the words without flinching. The loan had come in spring of 1874. After the dry summer of 1873 had taken more cattle than he could replace. After the winter before that had taken his wife, after a year in which the Set Ranch had bled money in every direction, and he had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had come out wrong no matter how many times he ran it. Edgar Pruitt ran the first bank of Reed Creek, had run it for 15 years, had run half the financial arrangements in the county for longer than that, a man who knew where every note was held, who owed what, and when. The loan terms had seemed reasonable at the time. Ward said this without self-pity. He said it the way a man states a fact that has since made him feel foolish, but that he has mostly finished feeling foolish about. 18% per annum, 2 years. He had believed, in the spring of 1874, that 2 good seasons would cover it. There had not been 2 good seasons. There had been a dry summer, and a respiratory illness moving through the herd, and an early frost that came 6 weeks before it should have. And now it was October 1875. And April 1876 was 5 months away. Nallen listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not offer reassurance before he was finished. She waited until he had said everything there was to say, and then she sat with it for a moment, in the quiet. Then she asked, "Is Pruitt the kind of man who wants the money or the kind of man who wants the land?" Ward looked at her, not surprised that she had asked it. Surprised that she had asked it so quickly and so precisely. "He's the kind of man," Ward said slowly, "who already knows what he'll do with the land when he gets it." She nodded, and that was the shape of it. She did not sleep well that night, not from fear, from thinking. There was a difference, and she had learned to tell them apart. Fear kept you still. Thinking moved you, even when you were lying flat in the dark, even when your body was not moving at all. She lay on the cot and turned the numbers over. The herd at its current count would not cover the debt. Not close. But the herd at its current count was not the only number. The spring was running, slow still, but running. If they cleared the second side of the blockage, which she intended to do tomorrow, the flow would increase. If the flow increased, the creek bed would carry water down through the lower pasture. If it carried water, the grass in the 40 yards she had already seen would spread, extend itself, and, on the other side of the ridge, 160 acres copper-colored grass, alive at the roots, waiting, she calculated, if they could get cattle onto that land by spring. If the grass came in the way she believed it would come in given water. If the herd could build through calving season, which was coming, She could see it in 3 of the cows already. Maybe. Not certainly. But maybe, which was more than she had started with this morning. She turned onto her back and looked at the ceiling and thought about Edgar Pruitt. The kind of man who already knew what he would do with the land when he got it. She had known men like that. Not cattle country men specifically, but men who understood that control of water was control of everything. Her father's people had understood this too, from the other side. From the side of people who watched that control being taken and had no legal standing to object. She would need to move carefully. She would need to move fast. She sat up in the dark and reached for the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. Started. Writing numbers. A second day at the spring was harder. She had been right about the limestone shelf. It was buried 3 feet under the bank's face, and when the spade hit it, the impact came up through the handle and into her shoulders before the sound did. Hard and cold and unyielding, Ward crouched and looked at the angle. "We need to come at it from the east," she said. 4 feet over, he didn't question it. He moved, they relocated the line and started again. It added 2 hours to the work. The temperature dropped in the early afternoon. That particular sharpness that came when a cold front was building to the northwest, she could feel it before she could see it. Her father had taught her that, not in words. In the way he had paused on certain mornings and turned his face north and then made decisions. "Weather's turning," she said. Ward glanced at the sky without stopping his work. Looked northwest for a long moment. "Tonight," he said. They pushed harder. By mid-afternoon, they had broken through. The shelf gave a section about 2 feet wide. Not dramatically. Not the sudden rush of water you might expect. Just a deepening of the seep. A widening, the water, finding the new opening the way water finds all openings, without hurry, without drama. Simply by following what the ground allowed. She watched it from the edge, and it was not the water that made her breath catch. It was Ward. He stood with the spade handle resting against his shoulder and watched the water move along the new channel. His face had changed. Not the relief of a problem being solved, not the satisfaction of work completed. Something older than that. Something that lived below the practical. Like a man watching a thing come back. That he had stopped believing would come back. She looked away. Some expressions were not meant to be watched. They pushed the cattle down from the upper pasture that afternoon. 23 head. The calves were confused and slowed everything, but Ward had patience for it. Moving with his horse at a low angle, never crowding, just redirecting, steady. Unhurried, she worked the left flank. Between the two of them, the herd came in without much complaint. Fitch leaned on the corral fence and watched and offered no assistance and no commentary, which she had come to understand was his way of indicating approval. When Fitch thought something was going wrong, he said so. When he thought something was going right, he watched in silence with his hat pushed back. And that was that, she had come to find it. In a strange way. Reassuring. That evening, Ward repaired the gate latch. She had noticed it was stiff since the second week, been working around it every day since, lifting and pulling in a specific sequence she had figured out without meaning to. The way you figure out workarounds when a thing is broken, and there is no time to fix it. When she came out after supper, the gate swung clean. She opened and closed it once, twice. Ward was at the well and didn't look over. She didn't say anything either, but she stood there a moment longer than she needed to. The night air cold on her face. The gate solid and easy in her hand. The cattle quiet in the corral. Small things. She was learning that this was a place of small things. Not large gestures, not declarations. Just a gate latch fixed in the evening. A cup of coffee set on the counter without being asked for. A horse stopped twice on a fence line, so she could crouch and look at what she needed to look at. Small things that if you paid attention, added up to something larger than any single gesture could carry. That night the front arrived, rain first. Then the temperature, dropping fast. Then the rain turning thin and needling against the window glass. She lay in the dark and listened to it and thought about the cattle. Decided they were fine. In the south pasture with the tree line at their backs, thought about the gate, thought about the numbers in her notebook, thought about Ward's face at the spring. She was 31 years old. She had spent 4 years learning how to want very little, learning how to make the calculus of survival fit inside the space that was available to her. It was a useful skill. She did not regret having learned it. But she was aware, lying in the dark with the rain on the roof, that she had been in this house for less than 3 weeks, and the space available to her felt larger than it had in a long time. She did not name that, not yet. She just noticed it. The way you notice a change in the air before a storm. Before you know what kind of storm it will be. She pulled the quilt higher and listened to the rain turn hard on the roof. By morning there would be ice on the pail. She was right. She broke it with the heel of her palm. One clean strike. No hesitation, the cold came up through her skin and stayed. Ward was already at the barn. She could see the thin line of lantern light under the door. She drew water for the house and went back to the kitchen and built the fire and had coffee on before the cold had finished making itself at home in her hands. When he came in, his boots were wet past the ankle, a cut on the back of his right hand. He didn't say what had happened, just poured his own coffee and stood at the window and drank it looking out at the south pasture. She put a cloth on the table. He looked at it, then sat down and held his hand out without a word. She wrapped it and tied it off in less than 2 minutes. He went back to his coffee. She noticed she was not bothered by the blood, that she had moved to deal with it the way she moved to deal with most things. Efficiently, without fuss. She also noticed he had let her, which was not nothing. Men who were accustomed to managing everything alone did not easily let someone else manage even a small thing. It required a kind of trust that had to be built, or a kind of exhaustion that finally overrode the habit of self-sufficiency. She thought, with Ward Callum. It was probably a little of both. Section of fence down past the 2nd grade marker, he said. I rode that line 2 weeks ago, she said. It was sound, post shifted in the frost. I can check the east line this afternoon if the temperature comes up. I'll go with you, he said. They ate. The ordinary quiet of 2 people who had been sharing a table long enough that the silence had stopped being something to navigate and become something to rest in. She refilled his cup without asking. He looked up briefly. Acknowledgement, not surprise. Outside the window, ice was already softening at the edges. The sun on the south-facing slope doing its slow work. She told him about the money properly that week, not the night on the ridge. That had been the shape of it. This was the specific numbers, the actual gap, the timeline. She spread the ledger on the table after supper and went through it column by column. Ward sat across from her and did not look away from the numbers even when the numbers were difficult. Fitch sat at the end of the table with his coffee and did not pretend he was not listening. When she finished, she said, "Here is what I think," and she told him. The spring, now fully open, would carry water down through the East Creek bed through winter. The flow was not strong, but it was consistent by March. The low ground along the creek would be moist enough to sustain new grass. The 160 acres on the other side of the ridge, if they put a temporary fence line along the top and moved cattle onto it in April, would produce enough additional grazing capacity to rebuild the herd through summer. She had run the numbers 3 times. If the calves came in healthy, if the spring held, if they could hold Pruitt off until summer, not pay him but hold him, keep him in procedure long enough to get cattle on that east pasture and show the land producing, there was a case to be made that the ranch was viable, that the note could be renegotiated. A thin case, but a case. Ward listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then, Pruitt doesn't want to renegotiate. I know. He wants the land. I know that too. Another silence. So we need to make it so he can't have it, she said. Not just financially. Legally, Ward looked at her. The deed is clean. The land is mine. There's no legal. There's always something, she said, quietly. Not argumentatively, just stating a fact she had learned from a long time of watching systems operate. With a man like Pruitt, there is always something. Ward said nothing. Fitch, at the end of the table, had gone very still. She noticed Fitch going still. She filed it away. She had learned to notice Fitch. Not because he was loud or demonstrative, he was neither. But because he was the kind of man who had been around long enough to have accumulated things. Information, history, the particular kind of knowledge that comes from proximity to power and then leaving it. A man like that knew things. A man like that, who had gone still, at exactly the mention of Pruitt having legal options, knew specific things. She waited. She did not ask him directly. She had learned, in her years of living between worlds, that direct questions were not always the right tool. Sometimes you made a space, and waited to see what moved into it. She made the space. Fitch did not move into it that night, or the next, but she was patient. On a night in mid-December, 3 weeks after she had opened the account books, she found him in the barn, after supper, sitting on an overturned bucket in the corner with a bottle that was more empty than full, and the look of a man conducting a private trial in which he was simultaneously the defendant and the jury. She came in for the lantern she had left hanging on the nail by the door. She lifted it, turned to go. Fitch said, "You can sit down if you want to." She turned back. She sat on a hay bale and set the lantern between them. He looked at the bottle. "I worked for Pruitt," he said. "Before I came here, she waited 4 years. 1867 to 1871. I knew how he operated. I knew what he stopped. I left because of what he did to a man named Garfield Toms, sheep farmer, North County. Good man." Pruitt called his note early on a technicality. In a bad season. Toms had nowhere to go and nothing to go on, and Pruitt knew it. Fitch set the bottle on the ground. "I walked away that same fall. Ward needed someone. I stayed. Still she waited, because there was more. There was always more, with a man who waited this long to speak. Before I left," Fitch said, "I was in Pruitt's office, collecting my last pay. There was a map on his desk. Big one. Old. Drawn in 1858, the year. She knew that year. Ward's father drew that map," she said. Fitch looked at her. Something moved in his face. Surprise that she knew, or relief that he didn't have to explain it. "Yes," he said. "James Callum drew it himself. Surveyed every boundary of this property before Ward was old enough to ride. Had it notarized at the territorial court. That map showed every water right attached to this land. The spring, the East Creek, the 160 acres on the other side of the ridge. Every bit of it, recorded, witnessed, legal." He stopped. "Pruitt had it," she said. "Pruitt has it," Fitch said. "Has had it since 1872. When James Callum was sick, and his eyesight was failing, and Pruitt came out to offer assistance, and James signed something he couldn't read properly. Something that said Pruitt was holding the document for safekeeping. He picked up the bottle, set it down again without drinking. James died 4 months later, before he could get it back. Before he could tell Ward, she sat with that. The spring that had silted in 1873. The land that had been sitting unfenced since James Callum overextended and paid for it. The loan that Pruitt had offered Ward in 1874 at terms he had known Ward could not meet. Not bad luck, not simply bad seasons. A man with a plan and patience. And a document that proved the plan was unnecessary because the land was already legally Ward's. All of it, the spring, the East Acres. All of it. "Ward doesn't know," she said. "Ward thinks the map was lost in a fire in 1872. There was a fire. In the old outbuilding. Pruitt suggested that's where the records went. Ward had no reason to doubt it." Fitch looked at his hands. "I had every reason to tell him. 4 years of reasons. Why didn't you?" A long silence. "Because I was afraid of Pruitt," he said, "and because I told myself it didn't matter. That Ward's deed was still clean. That the land was still legally his even without the original map. That Pruitt couldn't do anything." He paused. "And then Pruitt offered Ward the loan, and I started to understand what he was doing. And I still didn't say anything." He looked at her directly for the first time, because by then I'd been lying by silence for 2 years and I didn't know how to stop. The lantern between them made shadows on the barn wall. The horses shifted in their stalls. One of the cattle coughed somewhere in the dark outside. Nalin sat with everything he had said, turned it over, looked at the shape of it. Then she said, "The map is still in his office? Last I knew. Locked drawer. Left side of the desk. You read it? Read enough of it. The boundaries were clear and the notarization? Original seal. Territorial Court 1858. He met her eyes. It is a legal document that proves Pruitt's survey from 1866, the one that redraws the boundary lines, was made against an existing registered claim. It would invalidate everything he's trying to do." She stood. She picked up the lantern. She looked at Fitch Dupree, a man who had carried a secret for 4 years until the weight of it had changed the shape of him. "You're not alone in this anymore," she said. She went back to the house. She did not sleep at all that night. She sat at the kitchen table, with her notebook and the ledger and a stub of candle, and she mapped everything she knew onto paper. Not the land map, the other kind of map. The one that showed how things were connected, who held what could be proved, what couldn't. What a man like Pruitt would do when he felt the ground shifting under him, because he would feel it, eventually. That was the thing about men like Pruitt. They had survived this long by being sensitive to the slightest change in the balance of things. The moment Ward stopped looking like a man resigned to losing, Pruitt would know. And he would move. She needed to move first. Or she needed to move in a way he couldn't see coming. She wrote, "What we have, the deed, the spring now running, the east land viable, calves coming in spring. Time, 5 months. What we need, the original map. Or evidence of it. Or testimony from someone who saw it." She stopped, looked at what she had written. Fitch had seen it. Fitch had read it. Fitch could describe every boundary, every notation, the notarial seal, the date. He had been in that office in 1871. He had been close enough to read a document on a man's desk. That was not nothing. That was in fact something. The candle burned lower. She kept writing. She told Ward in the morning. All of it. She waited until Fitch had come in from the barn and was sitting at the table with his coffee. Because Fitch deserved to be in the room when it was said. He had told her the truth. He deserved to hear it repeated to the person it belonged to, and Ward deserved to hear it from both of them at once, not piecemeal, not softened. Ward sat at the table and listened, his face when she started. Neutral, trained neutral. The kind that cost something to hold, his face as she continued, still. A different kind of still. The kind that meant something was moving underneath, that he was holding in place by force. When she finished, he looked at Fitch. Fitch didn't look away. 4 years, Ward said. Flat, yes. Fitch said, "You knew about the map." Yes. "You knew what Pruitt had." Yes. Ward was quiet for a very long time. The kind of quiet that was not absence but presence. The full weight of a man processing something that required complete attention. Then he said, "My father trusted him." "I know," Fitch said. "My father died thinking." "I know." Ward, silence. And then Ward did something Nolan had not expected. He put his elbows on the table and pressed his face into his hands. Not crying, not breaking, just going somewhere, for a moment. Into the full reality of what he had just been told. She understood the impulse. Sometimes you needed to put your face somewhere dark for a minute. Somewhere that was just yours. She and Fitch sat with him. Nobody spoke. After a moment, Ward raised his head. His face was composed. Whatever he had needed to do in there, he had done it. He looked at Nolan. "What do you want to do?" She looked back at him steadily. "I want to find a way to get that map," she said, "or make Pruitt prove it doesn't exist." Ward's jaw shifted. Something hardened there. "All right," he said. They did not have long to plan, because Pruitt came to them first. He arrived on a Tuesday in January, on a gray horse with 2 men riding behind him, who wore the leather badges of county deputies. He came to the front of the house and called out before dismounting. A man who understood the etiquette of ranches well enough to know you didn't ride into someone's yard unannounced, and unannounced could get you shot. Ward came out. Nayland came to the door and stayed there. Pruitt was 62 years old, heavier than his horse seemed pleased about, a face that had once been handsome in a broad, well-fed way and had traveled into something harder. He wore a suit that cost more than Ward's monthly food expenses. He was polite. He was almost warm. That was what made her skin tighten. Men who were coming to deliver bad news. and who knew they had the power to deliver it without consequence, often came with warmth. "Ward," he said, "I hate to be the one to bring this to you. I truly do." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded document. He held it out. Ward took it and read it. His face gave nothing. "Boundary survey," Pruitt said. "Conducted under the Reconstruction Land Act of 1866. Authorized resurvey of all territorial land parcels following the war. I'm afraid the East Creek and the land beyond the ridge were incorrectly included in your deed. The correct boundaries, per the 1866 survey, place that water source and those 160 acres outside the Callum parcel." Ward refolded the document and held it without speaking. "I know this is a hard thing to hear," Pruitt said. "I want to give you time to review it with a lawyer. I'm not looking to cause hardship," a pause that had been rehearsed until it sounded spontaneous. "But the bank will need clarification of what collateral remains against the outstanding loan." Given the adjustment in land value, Nayland stood in the doorway and watched Edgar Pruitt's face. She had seen men like him before, not here. In a different world, a different kind of power, but the same essential shape, the shape of a man who had spent decades making sure every move he made was legal, not because he believed in the law, because he understood that the law, handled correctly, was the most effective weapon available to someone who already had everything else. "I'll be in touch," Pruitt said pleasantly. He tipped his hat, rode away. The two deputies rode with him without looking back. Ward stood in the yard until they were out of sight. Then he turned and walked back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put the document in front of Nolan. She read it twice. The name of the surveyor was a man named Clarence Dodd. She did not know the name. She noted the date, September 1866, 1 year after the war. The boundary lines drawn in a way that, if you did not have the 1858 map, if you had no record of what the original survey had established, looked entirely legitimate. She set the document down. "Clarence Dodd." She said, "Never heard of him," Ward said. "Neither have I." She looked up. "Which is interesting. If you were going to conduct a legitimate resurvey of every parcel in this county in 1866, people would know the name. You would hear it repeatedly. It would be in other documents." Ward looked at her. "You think the survey is fabricated," he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that a document prepared in advance, for a purpose, by someone who controls both the bank and has significant influence with the county clerk, would look exactly like this." Fitch came in from the back. He looked at the document on the table, then at both of them. "He's moving faster than I thought he would," he said. "He's moving because the spring is running," Nolan said. "Because he has eyes on this property, and someone told him the water situation changed." She looked out the window, and she began, very carefully, to think. January was cold, the kind of cold that moved in and unpacked its things and made itself comfortable. Ice on the water pails every morning. Ice on the inside of the window glass if you let the fire burn too low. The cattle kept to the south end of the pasture where the cottonwoods broke the wind, and the new calves were coming. She could see it in two of the cows now, the fullness, the changed way they held themselves. She checked the fence line every other day. She kept the books. She did the work that needed to be done, and she thought. Constantly. The way she had always thought. Not in conversation with other people, but in the steady interior monologue that had been her company for as long as she could remember, running and rerunning the problem. Looking at it from each direction. Finding the edges. The edges of this problem were clear. Pruitt had the original map, or claimed it did not exist. Fitch had seen the map, could describe it. But Fitch's testimony, the word of a ranch hand against a judge, would carry limited weight without corroborating evidence. The deed to the land was clean. Ward's legal ownership of the main parcel was not in dispute. But the east acres and the water source were now contested. With the 1858 and without the 1858 map, the 1866 survey would likely prevail. She thought about this for 3 weeks, in the evenings after supper. In the mornings, at the window, watching the light come up. On horseback, checking the fence, she thought about what she had, what Ward had, what Fitch had, what any of them could prove, and how. And slowly, the outline of something began to form. Not a plan, exactly. Not yet. More like the beginning of one. The shape of an approach. She needed to write a letter, but not yet. Not until she was certain of every word. The night they came was a Thursday. She knew it was Thursday, because she had been doing the accounts. She marked the days in the ledger margin, a habit from years of keeping track of things that nobody else was tracking. She had not expected it to be so soon. She had thought Pruitt would wait, that he would use the legal process, the slow grind of county procedure and bank paperwork, to apply pressure over months. That was what men like him usually did. They had patience. They had learned that patience was a form of power when your opponent was watching the clock. But apparently Pruitt had decided to supplement the legal process. She heard the horses first, 3 of them, coming in from the northwest, which was wrong. The main road came from the south. You only came from the northwest if you were crossing open country to avoid being seen on the road. She was out of her chair before she had finished processing the sound. She went to the window. Dark, no moon that night, just stars, and the flat, cold light they made on the dry grass. Then she saw the flicker, west side of the barn, near the corner, where the haystack stood against the outer wall, under the lean-to roof. She had her coat on, and the rifle off the wall before she had made a conscious decision to move, outside. Cold hit her face like a hand. The hay was burning at the base. Not large, they had just started it. The dry grass and old straw catching fast in the winter air. She could hear the horses, the 3 from the northwest. Moving away now, a fire set and abandoned. A message delivered. She shouted for Ward and Fitch. They were out within 30 seconds. The 3 of them formed a line, water pails from the trough, earth shoveled from the frozen ground at the barn's edge. Fitch stamping at the base of it with his boots, while Ward and Nolan threw water and she threw dirt, and Ward threw water again. 15 minutes. It felt longer. When it was done, the corner of the lean-to was scorched, and 1 haystack was lost, and her hands were trembling slightly from cold and the aftermath of the kind of focus that uses everything you have and leaves you empty when it stops. She stood in the yard, looked at the scorch mark on the barn wall, looked at the direction the riders had gone. Ward stood beside her. His breathing had steadied. His face in the darkness was something she could not quite read, and she had become, over these weeks, a fairly reliable reader of Ward Callum's face. She thought it was fury, the controlled kind, the kind that had been compressed so many times over so many years that it had changed state entirely. Not burning, just solid. Just wait, he said. I don't want you more involved in this than you already are. She turned and looked at him. You said that before, she said. In November. After I'd already opened your account books and ridden your fence line and cleared your spring. He was quiet. Ward. He looked at her. I signed my name to this place, she said. You put my name on that paper and I chose to let you. That means I am already as involved as it is possible to be. The night around them was very still, cold, clear. The stars indifferent and very far away. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, What do you want to do? She turned back toward the house. I need to write a letter, she said. The calves came in February, 3 of them. One night, all 3 knew it was coming. She had watched the cows for 2 weeks. The signs were not subtle if you knew what to look for. She had checked on them twice the day before and the day before that, and on the evening in question, she sat with her dinner half-eaten, and then stood up and put her coat on. Fitch looked at her. South pasture, she said. He nodded and got up too. Ward was already there. He had gone out at 3 in the morning, he said, without being asked, without alerting anyone, just gone out because he knew, and because going out at 3 in the morning, in February, in Oklahoma Territory, to check on cattle, was the kind of thing he did without needing a reason beyond the fact that they needed it. The 3 of them worked through the night. The first calf came without difficulty. The second needed help. She and Ward worked together in the lantern light, and Fitch stood with the cow's head in his hands, talking to her in a low, continuous murmur. that was part instruction and part something else, something that did not quite have a category. The third calf was the small one. It came late. The sky was already starting to lighten when it arrived, small and wet and bewildered by the fact of existence. It lay on the cold ground and its mother cleaned it, and it tried to stand and fell, tried again. Fell. Ward crouched beside it, did not touch it, just watched, very still, in the way he watched things when he was waiting to see what they would do on their own, before deciding whether to intervene. The calf tried a third time, stood, wobbled. 4 legs going in 4 independent directions, negotiating with gravity, working out an arrangement, and held. Nalin stood a cup of fence with her coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She watched the calf find its legs, watched it take 3 uncertain steps, watched Ward. Still crouched watching it, he said quietly, "That one's going to give us trouble." She thought he was probably right. But she thought it was the good kind of trouble. The kind that meant something had made it through the winter. Ward stood slowly. He came and stood beside her at the fence. They looked at the 3 calves in the early gray light. The cows quiet now. The cold still absolute, but with the specific quality of cold that had peaked and was beginning imperceptibly to consider its options. Not spring yet. Nowhere near spring, but the suggestion of it, the distant possibility of it. Fitch came and stood on her other side. The 3 of them looked at the new lives standing in the February light, and nobody said anything for a long time. Which was exactly right. Some things did not need words. Some things were just what they were. She wrote the letter that week, sat at the kitchen table on 3 separate nights, writing and crossing out and writing again. She was not a woman who wrote carelessly. Words were not nothing. They were tools. And like all tools, they worked best when they were precisely right for the job. The letter was addressed to the editor of the Oklahoma Territory Gazette, the largest paper in the territory. Reed and Guthrie, in Stillwater, in a dozen towns between the Kansas border and the Texas line. She wrote in plain language, factual, no sentiment, no performance of outrage. She described the loan made in 1874 at terms she detailed precisely. She described the survey document of 1866, the name Clarence Dodd, and the notable absence of that name from any other county record. She described the original map of 1858, drawn by James Callum, notarized at the territorial court, witnessed by 2 men whose names she had found in the county birth register as long-term residents, and the fact that this document had not been seen since Edgar Pruitt had visited the Callum Ranch in 1872 during James Callum's final illness. She described the fire in January 1876. The 3 riders from the Northwest. The burned hay. She named no conclusions. She simply asked, at the end, "Where is the 1858 map? And what does its absence tell us?" And she signed it, Nalin Callum, ranch manager, Callum Ranch, Oklahoma Territory. It was the first time she had written that name on paper. She sat and looked at it for a moment after. Nalin Callum. 2 names that came from different worlds that had, through the unforeseeable movements of lives, found themselves belonging to the same piece of ground, the same spring, the same ridge, the same colt-legged calves, finding their footing in the February cold. She set the pen down. She put the letter in the center of the table. And, in the morning, when Ward came in for coffee, she sat across from him and waited while he read it. He read it slowly, every word. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. "You're sure?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I've been sure since the night they burned the hay," she said. He looked at the letter again. Something in his face she had not catalogued before. Not relief exactly. Not gratitude. Something quieter than both. The particular look of a person who has been carrying something alone, long enough to forget what it felt like not to. He nodded once. She picked up the letter. She put on her coat. She walked out into the February morning and rode into Reed Creek and handed it to the postmaster and asked him to send it that day. The air on the ride back smelled like coming snow. And underneath the snow, just barely, impossibly far away, the first suggestion of something else, something that came after. The letter ran on a Thursday, page 1, below the fold. But page 1, she knew because Fitch rode into Reed Creek for feed and came back with a copy tucked inside his coat, which he set on the kitchen table without a word, and then went back outside to unload the wagon. As if the newspaper were something fragile, as if setting it down too hard might change what was printed inside it. She read it standing up. Ward read it sitting down. The editor had not changed a word, had not softened a single sentence, had added above her letter a brief note of his own. The Gazette invites any party with knowledge of the 1858 Callum Survey document to contact this office or the Territorial Land Commission directly. That last part she had not written. The editor had added it himself, which meant the editor had thoughts about Edgar Pruitt, which meant she was not the first person who had ever had thoughts about Edgar Pruitt, which meant Pruitt had made enemies before this, and some of them read the newspaper, and some of them were in a position to do something about it. She set the paper down. Ward looked at her. How long before he responds? Publicly? He won't. Men like Pruitt don't respond to newspapers, they respond to leverage. She picked up her coffee, but privately, he'll move. Within the week, she was right about the week. She was wrong about what the move would look like. She had expected lawyers. Another document. An escalation through official channels which was, she had calculated, the most likely path for a man who had always operated through the appearance of legitimacy. What she had not expected was the 3 men at the door on a Wednesday morning. Not deputies. Not leather badges. These 3 wore nothing official at all. Just coats, just hats pulled low. Just the particular way of standing that men stand when they are being paid to stand somewhere and make the occupants of a building feel the weight of the fact that they are standing there. Ward opened the door. Nolan stood behind him and slightly to the left, her hand not on anything. Not yet, the tallest of the 3 said they had a message from Mr. Pruitt. That the letter had caused Mr. Pruitt considerable professional embarrassment. That men who caused Mr. Pruitt considerable professional embarrassment times found the resolution of their legal difficulties became complicated. Not a threat. Not exactly. The kind of message designed to be not exactly a threat, so that the person delivering it could say, afterward, that no threat was made. Ward listened to all of it without moving. Then he said, "Tell Mr. Pruitt I'll see him at the hearing," and closed the door. Nallen stood in the kitchen and listened to the 3 horses leave. She was shaking very slightly. Not from fear. From the particular physical response the body makes when it has been ready for something violent, and the violent thing does not quite arrive. She breathed through it. Ward turned from the door. He looked at her hands. "We need to talk about the hearing," she said. "Yes," he said. "Sit down," she said. She began. They had 3 things. Ward's deed, Fitch's testimony, the letter, now public. These were real. These mattered. But they were not the map. "We don't go to win outright," she said. "We go to make the investigation unavoidable." Ward nodded slowly. "When is the hearing?" "April 3rd, she said. 4 weeks. 4 weeks. She had things to do. The first week of March came in warm and then cold and then warm again the way Oklahoma March always came. Unable to decide which season it was committed to, she checked the spring every 3 days. The East Ridge was changing. The copper-colored grass she had read in October softening now, the water table coming up. She stood on the ridge and looked north and thought about the fence they would need. Temporary to start. Enough to get cattle onto the East Land by April. She came back and told Ward what she had seen. He listened the way he listened to her assessments now. With full attention, no skepticism. Not because he had decided she was always right, but because he had learned, over 5 months, that what she saw when she looked at Landon was real. That morning he ordered fence posts from the feed store in Reed Creek. 200. She had said 150. She did not comment on this. But she noticed. They left before dawn, April 3rd, all 3 of them. Ward on his gray horse, Fitch on the bay, Nallen on the short bay mare with a patient eye and the one white sock, who had carried her across enough of this territory by now to feel like a partnership rather than a transaction. The road to Stillwater was 40 miles. They rode mostly in silence. The country was doing something beautiful in the early April morning. The grass, catching the low light at an angle that made it look like it was lit from underneath. Like the land had been storing something through the long winter and was only now beginning to release it. She rode and looked and thought about what she would say if she was asked to say anything. She wanted to say something to Ward. Before the room, before the commissioners, before Edgar Pruitt in his expensive suit, she did not know what, so she rode alongside him and said nothing, which was. She had come to understand its own kind of language between them. The county building in Stillwater was already busy when they arrived. A dozen people standing outside in the April morning, speaking in low clusters. The feed store owner from Reed Creek. The woman from the general store who had watched through the glass on the morning Nallen first arrived. 2 farmers she did not know, and a young man with a notebook who asked Ward for a statement. "I'll have one after," Ward said inside. The long room, high windows, 5 commissioners at the table at the front, and Pruitt, already there, with 2 lawyers who held themselves like men, who understood the rules of a room better than anyone else in it, and wanted you to know they knew. Pruitt nodded at Ward when they entered, pleasantly, the warmth of a man who believed he still had this. She settled into her chair and read the commissioners' faces the way she read the land. 2 leaned unfavorably toward Pruitt, 1 uncertain, 2 unreadable. Enough to work with. Pruitt's lawyer spoke first. 40 minutes she had. Expected 20. He went 40, burying the commission in procedural language in the text of the Reconstruction Land Act, in documentation that was accurate and voluminous and designed to be exhausting. It was well done. She gave him that. She sat and listened to every word, not just for content, for what was absent, for the name, Clarence Dodd, that he mentioned only once and quickly, as if skating over ice he knew was thin. She wrote 3 things in her notebook. Ward stood without the confidence of someone trained to stand in rooms like this. He stood the way he always stood, solidly. Without performance, he stated the facts, the deed, the land he had worked for 20 years, the water source his father had developed, the loan taken in good faith in 1874, the fire in January 1876. He said the fire without emphasis, just, there was a fire, set by men who came from the Northwest. He filed a report. He received no response. 1 commissioner wrote something down. Then Fitch stood. She told him only this: be specific, be calm, be facts. Anger looks like grievance. Facts look like truth. Fitch was specific. Fitch was calm. He described the map, the dimensions, the handwriting, the boundary lines, the notarial seal. He named Harold Beecham. He sat down. The commission chair looked at Pruitt's lawyer. "Can Mr. Pruitt account for the whereabouts of the 1858 Callum survey document?" The lawyer said the document did not exist. "We have pulled the record," said Commissioner Webb. "Mr. Beecham's commission records for 1857 and 1859 are complete. The record for 1858 is missing from the archive, a silence, the kind that fills a room so completely that no one wants to be the first to displace it." Pruitt's lawyer said records went missing. "It happened," Webb said. "No, it doesn't indicate wrongdoing. It indicates absence. We will note that absence." Then Pruitt himself stood. She had not expected that. He looked at the commission, not at Ward. "Gentlemen, I have proceeded throughout this matter with the full backing of territorial law and the legitimate survey conducted in 1866. I respect Mr. Callum. But the law does not bend for unfortunate situations." A pause. "And I would ask the commission to consider the procedural standing of the letter that instigated this hearing. Under current territorial statute, the signatory, a person without recognized legal capacity under territorial land law, cannot be considered a valid party to this proceeding. The letter may have been published. That does not make it admissible. That does not make it evidence. And it does not make the claims within it anything other than the private grievances of someone with no legal standing to bring them." He sat down. The room went very still. She felt Ward go still beside her, the particular stillness of compressed fury, She put her hand on the table, not touching him, just there, visible. A reminder, not yet, not this way, but Ward was already standing up. He stood the way he stood when he came into the room. Solidly, without performance. But something had changed in the quality of it. He was not standing to give testimony. He was standing because he had made a decision. He looked at the commission, not at Pruitt. The letter that brought this hearing was written by the person who has managed this ranch for the past 6 months, who found the water source that is in dispute, who identified, before anyone else, that the survey being used against us was inconsistent with the land as it actually exists. He stopped. Let that be complete. She read this land better than any man I have hired in 20 years of working it. She rebuilt what I had let fall into ruin. She stood beside me every day of the worst winter this ranch has seen and did not once suggest that the difficulty was a reason to leave. Another stop. The commissioners were very still. She stands here today because I asked her to stand here, because this is her place as much as it is mine, and I will not sit down and let a man who has never walked an acre of my land tell this commission that her words are worth less than his. He sat down. The room stayed still for a moment, longer than a moment. Webb looked at Pruitt. Then he looked at Nolan. "We have heard your letter, Mrs. Callum," he said. "The commission it clearly and carefully written. We read it in full." She held his gaze steadily. "Thank you." Webb looked down at his papers. "The commission will recess. We will want to review the record of Harold Beecham's notarial for commissions in full, and we will be formally requesting that Mr. Pruitt produce, for our inspection, all documents in his possession related to Callum Land Holdings." A pause. "If any such documents exist," Pruitt's lawyer began to speak. Webb held up one hand. "That is not a request," Webb said pleasantly. "That Mr. Pruitt is in a position to decline." They stepped outside while the commission recessed. The April day had warmed while they were inside. The sky was the particular blue of Oklahoma in April. Not the flat tin of winter or the bleached white of summer, but something in between. Something clear and purposeful. The young man from the Guthrie Daily Press was waiting. Ward looked at him. "The commission recessed," Ward said, "to investigate fully." "That's my statement," the young man wrote it down. Then looked at Nolan. "And you?" She thought for a moment. "The land was always ours," she said. "We just had to wait until the room was ready to hear it." The young man wrote that down too. Fitch stood at the edge of the building and tilted his face up toward the April sun and closed his eyes. He looked like a man who had said something very heavy on the ground and was deciding whether his back felt better. Without it, she thought it probably did. She and Ward stood side by side on the steps of the county building. Not touching, just standing. Looking at the street, at the few people still gathered near the door, at the cottonwood trees at the end of the block just beginning to get their leaves back. Tentative and pale and new, he said, "You didn't tell me you were going to call it your place." She looked at him. "In the letter," he said, "you called it your place. I called it the Callum Ranch," she said. "Which is what it is." He was quiet for a moment. "I meant what I said in there," he said, "about it being yours as much as mine." She looked at the cottonwood trees. "I know," she said. "I'm not sure I've said that directly. You haven't. I'm saying it now." She turned and looked at him. This man who chose words the way he chose tools, nothing extra, nothing ornamental, and who had just said something that was, for him, the equivalent of a speech. "I heard you," she said. He nodded. They went back inside. The commission recessed for 2 hours and then reconvened to announce that the matter required deeper examination, that they were formally requesting the full documentation related to the 1866 Dodd survey, that Pruitt was required to present, at a follow-up hearing within 30 days, all documents in his possession related to Callum Land, which meant he had 30 days to decide what to do about a document he had been keeping in a locked drawer for 4 years. They rode back in the last of the daylight, 40 miles in the opposite direction, the sky doing what Oklahoma skies did in April, color without apology. Ward rode beside her, not ahead, beside. Neither of them spoke, which was its own kind of answer. 18 days later, a letter arrived from the Territorial Land Commission. The investigation into Clarence Dodd had been completed. No record of a licensed surveyor by that name existed in territorial records from 1860 through 1876. The 1866 survey document was being suspended pending further review. In the interim, the East Acres and water source would be treated as part of the Callum deed, and additionally, the commission noted that Edgar Pruitt had, upon formal request, produced for their inspection an original survey document dated 1858, drawn by James Arthur Callum, notarized by Harold Beecham, describing the full boundaries of the Callum land holding. Pruitt stated that this document had been held in his possession for safekeeping at the request of James Callum in 1872, and that he had intended to return it to the estate, but had been unable to locate the appropriate party. The commission had chosen to accept this explanation, which was, she knew, the commission choosing the version of events that allowed everyone to move forward without a perjury trial, which was sometimes how institutions worked, which was imperfect, which was also, practically speaking, what mattered. The map existed, was real, was now on record at the Land Commission. The 1866 survey was invalidated. The East Acres were Callum land. And the loan. The loan had been reviewed in light of the corrected land valuation. With the East Acres, the spring water rights, and the assessed grazing capacity of the full parcel, the ranch was worth considerably more than Pruitt's note. More than double. The note had been renegotiated. Lower rate. 3 years. Manageable. Fitch read the letter twice, and then looked out the window for a long time, without saying anything. Ward read it once and set it on the table and went outside. She stayed at the table, read it a third time, not to check the words. She had understood them the first time. She read it a third time, because she wanted to be inside the fact of it for a moment longer, before the day moved on to the next thing. Before the fence posts needed setting, and the cattle needed moving to the east pasture, and the accounts needed updating, and the 1,000 small urgent things of the ranch needed doing. Just one more moment. In the fact of it, say James Callum's map, a document drawn by a man who believed his son would inherit something worth protecting, locked in a drawer by a man who believed he could make the truth disappear. If the paper that proved it disappeared with it, it had not disappeared. It had waited, the way things waited in this country, underneath, in the dark, in the compressed silt, waiting for someone to come along with a long-handled spade, and the sense to ask where the water was. She folded the letter carefully, placed it at the front of the ledger, between the pages where she tracked the years. Spring arrived that year without apology. The east pasture came in green through April. Not slowly, quickly, almost startlingly, once the water reached it. Once the root systems that had been holding on through years of drought finally had what they had been waiting for. She stood on the ridge the first morning she saw it, and did not move for a long time. Green, real green. Not the pale suggestion of it. Real. They moved 12 head of cattle onto the east pasture in the 3rd week of April. Ward and Nayland and Fitch, and 2 new hands, brothers named Tom and Reuben Gale from across the county line, who had heard about the expanded operation and come looking for work. Good hands, quiet, the kind who knew cattle and kept to themselves. She managed the books. Ward managed the land. The line between those two things blurred constantly. Because the books were about the land and the land required the books, and neither could be done in isolation from the other. She had stopped thinking of them as separate things. She had stopped thinking of a lot of things as separate that she had once kept carefully divided. The Oklahoma Territory Gazette ran a second piece in May, longer than the first, about the ranch, the expanded operation, the East Acres now fully under use. They got the details of the land right. They spelled her name wrong again, Nina, not Nolan. She found the clipping, read it. Took a pencil and corrected the name in the margin, clearly, without anger. Nalin. This is the correct spelling. She dated it, tucked it into the front of the ledger, behind the commission letter. Ward found it there 2 days later. She knew because she came into the kitchen and the ledger was sitting slightly different on the shelf than she had left it. Open a hair, then closed. He had picked it up and read and put it back. He didn't mention it, neither did she. But that evening at supper, Fitch said, completely unprompted, that he had always thought names were worth getting right. Ward said nothing. But he didn't disagree. She noticed the chair on a morning in late April. She came out before dawn to start the fire, went back through the kitchen for her coat, and stepped out onto the front porch to check the sky, the temperature, the direction of the wind, the things she checked every morning, as automatic as breathing. The chair was there, the old chair, Ward's chair, the one that had been on this porch for years, weathered to a particular gray that wood gets when it has been outdoors through many seasons and has stopped minding. And beside it, a new one, not new in the sense of purchased, new in the sense of made recently. The wood was different, lighter, unstained, still smelling faintly of the shavings it had come from. The same proportions as the first chair, the same angle. Facing the same direction, east where the light came first, she stood and looked at both chairs for a moment. She did not ask about it. She did not go and find Ward and ask him when he had made it or what it meant or whether he intended something by placing it there. She knew when he had made it. She had heard him in the evenings, in the small sounds from the shed attached to the south side of the barn. Wood and tools. The particular rhythm of a man doing a careful thing without hurrying. She had thought he was repairing something. He had been building something. She sat down, this in the new chair. It fit the porch the way it had been designed to fit the porch. The right height, the right angle. You could sit in it and see the east ridge and the low ground along the creek where the new grass was coming in, and the far hills beyond. All of it in one view, all of it from this one place. He had built the chair in this space. Knowing this view, she sat in it while the sky changed from black to gray, to the pale silver that came just before the sun. She heard the door behind her. Ward came out. He did not comment on her being in the chair. He sat in his own chair beside her, set his coffee cup on his knee, looked at the eastern sky. She looked at the eastern sky too. The first color came, not dramatic, not the orange and red of winter sunrises, but a quiet gold. The kind of light that crept in rather than announced itself. The cattle were already moving on the east pasture. She could see them from here, dark shapes against the new green, moving, with the slow deliberateness of animals who had found good ground and knew it. Fitch came out a few minutes later, stood at the porch railing, and looked at the view. Looked at the two chairs, looked at Ward and then at Nolan, went back inside. She heard him start the fire. She and Ward sat until the light was fully up. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the morning was not already saying. The spring ran. The grass grew. The calves, all three, including the small one that had given them trouble, and kept his promise, grew into something that was going to be fine. She sat in the chair that had been built for this view, for this porch, for this particular arrangement of two people who had each spent years carrying things alone and had, without quite deciding to, set those things down in the same place. She was 31 years old. She had come to this territory with a canvas bag and a sewing basket with a broken clasp, and 7 lines of honest words on a folded piece of paper. She had found a spring. She had found a map. She had written a letter and signed a name to it and waited to see what the name could carry. She was not who she had been in October. Or perhaps she was exactly who she had been in October and had finally found a place large enough to hold it. She was not unhappy. She had stopped being surprised that she was not unhappy. She had started believing it. The crow landed on the fence post nearest the gate that swung clean now, that had swung clean since November. The small thing that was not a small thing, and sat there in the April morning, looking at nothing in particular. The way crows look, like they are waiting for something that may or may not come, and then it lifted and went. The grass moved in the way it moves when there is no particular wind. Just the breathing of the country, steady and large and not indifferent after all. She stayed until the light was fully up. Ward stayed beside her. The East acres were green, the water ran, the name in the ledger was spelled correctly, and the chair solid and unhurried, and made with the kind of attention you give to something you intend to last, held her exactly as it had been built to do.